Okay. All righty, friends. So first off, welcome. Good to see so many folks here. And I'm just saying my heart's tickled to have an opportunity to have this conversation with some of my very, very dear friends who have emerged in this space. And of course, John, who will be joining us in a second, has been really tremendously influential. It's been tremendously meaningful to connect with him. And I think since 2018, Bart and I hooked up 2019 in the intellectual deep web. And I gotta say, there are few people in this world who are both more entertaining and more deep and more profound than John, than Alexander Bard. His intellectual deep web is inspiring. His way of being in the world, his vision across the breadth. Tyler Volk asked at the end of the last session, "Well, is UTOK really encompass everybody?" And I was like, "Well, not somebody like Bard. Bard Zoroaster are sort of outside UTOK, although I think they dance well together." So Alexander, Bard, thank you so much for being here. I really look forward to dialoguing. And over the last couple of years, another dear friend of mine, Bonnie, we have explored, I've started to learn, I'm still an amateur, but it's starting to really get a grip on process ontology, on what true naturalism really means, as opposed to the fake version that John and I are doing. I'm really looking forward to sharing about the layers of metaphysics in relation. And so what we have today is then a very exciting exploration and discussion where we're going to be talking about transcendent naturalism. John and I will be representing that. Bonnie is going to bring her perspective. At least at sometimes has talked about that as fierce naturalism. I'm not sure if that's still the term that she is using. Yes, and what that means. And then we have transcendent emergentism. And the title of our talk, and I think me and John and Bonnie are okay with naturalism. We'll explore that. We're going to get into what Bard feels about naturalism versus emergentism. And so we're going to be exploring the relationships and excavating the fault lines in relationship to these two sets of perspectives. And so here we are. If John's around, let me just see. Not sure if he's in yet or not in relationship to that. I don't. He's still not quite. Oh, there he is. Hey, John. Wonderful. Can you unmute yourself, friend? If you can you unmute? Ask to unmute.
Now I'm unmuted.
There he is. Okay. Woohoo! I think we're all here then. All right. So, John, I just gave an overview, introduction, Bonnie, Bard, Johnny, and me. I need to say that once. We're going to explore. So what we thought we'd do today in terms of basic order is that John's going to kick us off, giving us an outline of transcendent naturalism. Of course, John and I did a series on that. I thought we had a lot of excellent guests. We're going to wrap that series up with Layman Pascal and Bruce Alderman, who obviously will bring lovely things to say to summarize that. So we're going to start with that. Then Bonnie's going to give her take, explore a metaphysics that I think overlaps some, but also potentially critiques. And then Bard will bring his perspective. The last thing I'll say is, coming off of, obviously, I mentioned last time, UTOK emphasized sort of the enlightenment gap coming off of natural sciences. I look around today, you got materialism, idealism, and dualism, basically in the West. I think all of us would say, no, none of those are adequate. We need a new framework, a new philosophical framework for the 21st century and beyond. And it's time to start laying that down. So here we are. Let's get it rolling. John, if you would, take it away. I introduced you already and already told you what a brother in arms you are in this process and how much I admire and respect you and your leadership. And that goes really for certainly Alexander Bard and Bonita, and I shared that already. So welcome, my friend.
Thank you, Greg. And I'm looking forward to talking with you, Bonita, and with you, Alexander. So Greg asked me to give an overview of the argument. I'll try to keep it as brief as possible without leaving it with too many major gaps. I won't go over the argument in detail. I will often just refer to arguments that were made in detail in the previous conference presentation and on the series Transcendent Naturalism. So transcendent naturalism comes out of two proposals. It comes out of the proposal of extended naturalism, plus a proposal of a kind of extended naturalism that supports strong transcendence, where that transcendence is not just psychological in nature, but has real epistemological and ontological significance. And there's two main arguments here. Each one is a meta-argument, a convergence argument for a properly leveled ontology, and then a convergence argument for a conformity theory of knowing. And then the proposal is if you have a conformity theory of knowing with a leveled ontology, you can actually afford a strong transcendence. I will add to that something that I didn't make in the original talk, just a brief note on why that can be properly understood as sacred. So extended naturalism is the proposal that science, well, let's take what naturalism is standardly understood to mean, is that science is the natural sciences, that is where the naturalism comes, are those projects that dictate to us our fundamental ontology, our fundamental structure of reality. Now, that is usually interpreted without much justification as all of our ontology has to be derivable from the ontology of the natural sciences. And I argue that that actually doesn't make sense. You also have to include in naturalism everything that is presupposed in order to do science. Your ontology needs to include that, or you actually have a blind spot in your ontology. And that's the new book, by the way, by Adam Frank, an astrophysicist, Marcelo Gleiser, a theoretical physicist, and Evan Thompson, a 4E cognitive scientist. And just some shameless self-promotion, the chapter on the blind spot within cognition explicitly talks about Vervaeke's theory of relevance realization as the blind spot within cognition. So yay, John. Okay, so anyways, the idea here is if you do not include the standpoint from which you are doing science, then you actually have an incomplete and therefore incoherent ontology. And what I want to argue is, what does science actually presuppose? Well, it presupposes scientists doing science. And how do we work that? How do we have to extend our naturalism in order to include that? I take a look at three convergence arguments. One is from Blackowitz on what he calls the real difference. He argues that reductionism is based on the premise that only what is shared between things is ultimately real. That, he argues, can't be right. Real differences matter. Real differences are presupposed by real information. If there's no real information, there's no real intelligibility. And so you need real difference, which means you have genuine emergence. The next main argument comes from Hole. And this is the idea that communication needs redundancy. Redundancy needs levels of reality to it. And causal signaling is a form of communication, and therefore you need real emergence. Again, I'm not going to go over these arguments in a way that is intended to make them persuasively convincing. I have done that in the previous talk. We did that at the intro to Transcendent Naturalism. I am just referring to them. You can go back, and I'm going to take it that you're extending me the good faith that there are persuasive arguments for each one of these claims. The third argument comes from the work of Uraro, that science needs real structure. She makes a distinction between bottom-up causes that change actuality and top-down constraints that shape possibility into potentiality. And science, of course, needs top-down constraints. These are things like E equals MC squared, which are not events. They are real constraints, real structuring principles in reality. So far, we need a leveled reality in order to get real information, in order to get real causal signaling, in order to get real structure. And then we have Smith's vertical causation argument, Wolfgang Smith, which is the argument to the effect that The measuring device cannot be at the same ontological level as what is measured, especially when we come down to quantum entities. And so you need a real leveled ontology in order for measurement. So notice what science presupposes: real information, real causal signaling, real structural principles, and it presupposes real measurement. Integrating all of those together, all of those presuppose a leveled ontology. Vervaeke makes a similar convergent argument that I made at Ralston at length, which is in order for us to do science, we have to include the scientist in our ontology, and that converges with everything I've just said. Why is it not just emergence up? The problem with just emergence up, and this is not just my idea, many people have talked about this, is it gives you the level, the emergent level is epiphenomenal. It has no causal powers in its own right, or no constraining powers in its own right. The problem with epiphenomenalism, it's an oxymoronic term. It is a category for which we can find no non-controversial members. And it indicates that something exists, but does not make any difference in reality, and therefore is not knowable. I'm not going to go into that argument at length. I think if your ontology leads to epiphenomenalism, it is a modus tollens. You have led to a reductio ad absurdum. So you have to have real emanation and real emergence completely interpenetrating each other. You have a continuum. And when we talk about levels, all we're doing is picking out things that are particularly explanatorily causally relevant. Whole has a formal proof that each level has a distinct set of causal powers to it. And therefore, when we're talking about levels, we're just picking out something that is most causally relevant to the particular kind of explanation. But that is not that it is just an epistemic convenience. The levels are epistemic conveniences that refer to a real emanation emergence continuum. Now, what about the meta argument towards a conformity theory? So the opposite to conformity theory is our current modern theory that knowledge is a matter of representation. I have something in my head that represents the world. Pickstock, in her astonishing book, Aspects of Truth, A New Religious Metaphysics from 2020, reviews all of the distinction arguments that are supposed to support the proposal of representational knowledge and shows that within analytic philosophy itself, they have all been seriously undermined. The analytic-synthetic distinction, of course, has been undermined by Quine, the distinction between a conceptual scheme and its content by Davidson, the fact-value distinction, and the is-ought distinction by Putnam, Casebeer. Vervaeke has one that relevance is both a cause and a reason. And the theory data distinction by Quine and Duhem. So all of the distinctions that were supposed to, open up the space between mind and world for which representation was the bridge have been completely undermined. And what that returns you to is a conformity theory that the mind and reality are co-participating in shared principles of individuation, identification, intelligibility, and they're often mutually shaping each other, all the way from niche construction up to cultural worldviews. I also made an argument that cognition is, all the cognitive sciences are converging on the idea that cognition is a dynamic continuum of emergence up and top down, bottom up, top down, completely interpenetrating, dynamically realized processing. And if that was not tracking the grammar of reality, if that grammar of cognition was not tracking the grammar of reality, we would be facing a radical skepticism, a radical solipsism, because it would be that the mind in principle could not know reality, and we'd be into very deep Kantian problems, and I won't reveal all the sort of tensions and contradictions within the Kantian proposal. So we get a conformity theory. And then that links up with independent arguments within 40 cog sci launched by Gibson about the importance of affordances for perception and action and knowledge, Heidegger and the allothetic notion of truth that is deeper than the coherence or correspondence notion of truth, and Vervaeke's proposal that relevance realization is inherently transjective and binds the subjective to the objective together and is therefore more real. And all of these converge on a conformity theory of knowing. Now, if you have a real leveled ontology and a conformity theory of knowing, by knowing it, I know I'm not only engaging in psychological improvement, I'm actually knowing levels of reality that are otherwise inaccessible, and I am changing ontologically to different levels of the self that correspond through participation. Actually, I want to erase that sentence. Levels of the self that participate with levels of reality. And so that is strong transcendence. It is making a fundamental epistemological and ontological difference, not just psychological hygiene and improvement. I would add to that the current work, integrating the work of Filler, who argues that pure relationality has to be ultimate because you can't get relations from Aristotelian substances. Of course, our science has pure relationality at the bottom and at the top, and scientists are seeking the relation between the cosmological and the quantum. Nishida's argument that Aristotle's substance metaphysic, a substance is not stuff. A substance are independently existing objects, things. Aristotle's ontology, which we still fundamentally share, is that things are ultimately real and that relations and processes emerge from it, and that is tracked by a subject-predicate logic. Nishida shows, you get Filler's argument that that doesn't work. Relationality is deeper than subject and predicate and deeper than substance and its properties. Nishida shows the Aristotelian metaphysics is inherently contradictory because it depends on predication, which is of universals, but its ontology claims that individual substances, individual things are most real. And this is the problem of how can the universals ever know the particular? It bedevils medieval philosophy until the Aristotelian framework collapses and you get nominalism. And what they decide to do is keep the substance ontology. Individual things ultimately exist, but there are no real relations, no real patterns. They exist only in the mind. That's nominalism. That, of course, gives you a dualism because the mind is a fundamentally different kind of reality than reality. And then dualism gives you all the disasters of the meaning crisis. These are all arguments for abandoning a substance ontology and understanding that a no-thingness of pure relationality is what is ultimately real. Finally, making use of the work of the atheist Canadian, philosopher Schellenberg about what do we mean by the sacred. He talks about the triply transcendent, and this lines up now with transcendent naturalism. The sacred is that which is ontologically ultimate, and of course, we can conform to and participate in the ultimacy of pure relationality. Neoplatonism and Zen both talk about this. Soteriological, it can transform you. By entering into this relationship, of course, you get fundamental transformation of human beings because you're engaging in strong transcendence. It saves you, it liberates you, it frees you in epistemologically and ontologically significant ways, not just psychologically. And it's axiological. It gives you the reciprocal opening relationship as you get the ground of the self is opening up to the ground of reality. And they are ultimately non-logically identical because they are co-realizations, co-participations in the dynamic realization of pure relationality. And that reciprocal opening gives you a capacity to fall in love and to involve the whole of the self without in any way being self-involved. And this would be a touchstone for all other normative evaluations. So it would be axiologically transcendent. I can develop all of those arguments in greater detail if needed. So transcendent naturalism puts us into a participatory relationship with ontological ultimacy, soteriological ultimacy, axiological ultimacy, and that means it is also sacred. So transcendent naturalism gives an account of sacredness and ultimate reality that is nevertheless still consistent with naturalism, but that naturalism has to be extended naturalism. That's the gist of the arguments and some recent additions I have made to them. So thank you very much, everyone, for your time and attention.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So I think that's a brilliant and crisp summary of the core tenets. Christian put it in the group, and I mentioned that John and I have done the series. It brings in a number of different thinkers. I'm not going to get into it now because I did a review of UTOK and certainly have raised some questions. But let's just say what John just laid out is I'll borrow from Roy Bhaskar and say there's a philosophical underlaboring, a richness, and of course then extended into modern cognitive science that fits sort of with UTOK and sort of a lock and key. I am not a philosopher by training in relation. I got some notions, but the ways in which UTOK is structured as we dialogued is fundamentally consistent, and I think affords certain kinds of elaborations on what John was talking about. But I'm not going to get into that because we're really talking fundamentally about these different positions. What I want to do now is turn the discussion over to Bonita Roy so that she can share her perspective on naturalism, what John offers, and what she brings to bear in relation. You can unmute.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks.
There you go. Mm-hmm.
Woman's worst nightmare. First, I want to thank John and Gregg and all their guests because I've watched many, many hours of their Transcendent Naturalism series, and I really like season 2. I think it was, you designed it so that there are a lot of shakeups and different ideas and stuff coming in, and I think you broadened the problem and showed that there's a real critical importance to this, but also that it's not easy. Right? I don't think any of us think it's easy. So I'm glad that John ended with axiology, because for me, why does this all matter? I think where the rubber hits the road is that if we could come up with a system that is a transcendent naturalism that really helps people close the gap between the is and the ought, I think that this would be its biggest contribution as we struggle with science and the psyche and idealism and reductionism and stuff. This is kind of like the path toward that, but I really think that the goal, one of the huge goals, would be the axiological goal. I want to start with a quote. And the quote is to remind us, I think we all can agree with this quote, but we're here online and we're going to do a lot of talking and use a lot of words, but I just want to honor the fact that for me, and I assume for you, that this is a constraint and that we're after something that's really personal and sacred to us and meaningful to us personally at a deep level. And so the quote's from Warren Heide, and he writes, "How should one live? Not by painstakingly constructing a linguistic replica of a corner of the cosmos and then running repeatable experiments and quantifying the results, but by carefully reflecting on what we are and what living well means for us." So I think the journey often looks like constructing a linguistic replica of the corner of the cosmos. I think those are the tools that we use, but it's, I just want to remind us that I recognize in all of us that certainly is not our goal. I don't really have a model or a system or an argument to make. I want to introduce some tools that I think are useful in this project. And one tool is metaphysics. And my definition of metaphysics, amongst many others, is I think the purpose of metaphysics is to distinguish the true from the real. Now, we have to define those very precisely, and there's many different ways to define them. But the way I am meaning about that is kind of like what Bhaskar talked about. Science deals with the actual and not the real. And so for me, true is what science can get at. And I define science as the set of protocols that lead to actions, the set of protocols that lead to outcomes predicted by theory. And so science is in a box, a methodological box. It has a lot of constraints, and it can create true theories. But this is quite different from the real And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But I think that, and these are words you hear, John is talking about the transcendent as dealing in the realm of the real and not the realm of the actual, as Bhaskar would say, or the true. So I think that's an important tool to look at. I want to talk about stratified reality. And stratified reality is what we do when we say there's information, energy, and matter, and then mind too, and life, and this and that. There's, you go different cultures and different periods of human history, and people would not have organized the ontological stack that way. And so I was thinking this morning about where in our evolutionary history, pre-human, did we first encounter this ability to create ontological stacks. I mean, chimpanzees aren't running around creating ontological stacks, people are. But because I believe in the continuity of the animal mind with the human mind, I'm thinking this morning, where can I find the earliest template or the feeling sense of this kind of activity? And I thought about how animals will reduce a complex puzzle into parts. They do this. And so these are different steps of action. So I want you to think about what, this is what John said. What is the standpoint from which we are doing this? What is the standpoint from which we are creating stratified reality? And so I want you to feel into this sense that, okay, it starts in our pre-evolutionary history and our animal nature of reducing is not the right word, because reduce is like a bad word, or separating or distinguishing or discerning a complex puzzle into parts. As far as I can see, that's the first instant. And then this is what's fascinating. This carries on with early man into tool making, and the fact that we can teach tool making through a series of steps, and there's a series of parts. And then this starts this whole evolutionary advantage, I think, is what we are doing when is where it all started. And then now I want to reflect on something, and that is breaking into parts has always been a protocol for problem solving and making, but only recently has it become a protocol for getting at what is real, meaningful, or for moral choice. Now, I don't know what to make of that statement, because that was my insight this morning, driven by the energy of the participation of this panel. But it's something to think about, and maybe that's a good thing, because maybe we're doing a problem solving thing, but maybe there's something that needs to be converted there. Okay. However, given that, I want to talk about what people do when they do stratified reality. And there's something very interesting. There's a tendency to make a mistake. And that is, if we say, let me just give you an example. So if I say, what is pizza made of? Okay, and you can say, well, pizza is made of dough. And then I say, what is dough made of? And you say, dough is made of wheat. This presents a simplistic and reductive sense of what is going on, because a pizza is made of dough, but made with the people who proof the dough, the cook who's doing it, and the oven that's cooking it, and the oven, and blah blah blah. All of this, the with is lost. The with are all these verbs that don't survive the analysis. Okay, then we can say, well, what is dough made with? Dough made with wheat and the agricultural revolution, which is made with human evolution, which is made with the genealogy of the earth. And so one of the things that happens when we ontological stack along categories is all the with is gone. And it's kind of like the physicists that when they say, well, 97% of matter and energy, we can't get our hands on. And so there's something about this enterprise of categorization, stratifying reality that loses all the width. So that's the first thing I want to point out. And I only want to point out really one other thing. And that is, if you notice, as you go down, here's pizza, here's dough, here's pizza and a whole bunch of cooks and stuff, and the fact that you bought the flour. Okay, and then here's dough, and dough is made with wheat. As I go down, the systems that are left out become larger, not smaller. So Sabine Hofstenfelder has this strong critique against physics, and so does Eric Weinstein. And it's part of it is this problem, because if by the time you get to matter, and then you get to atoms, and then you get to subatomic particles, the Higgs boson is made with the whole scientific enterprise across all of human history, and the politicians, and the money. And Hofstenfelder's recently come out and said there's a real problem with the scientific enterprise. And this problematizes something like the Higgs boson. And so this sense that the lower you go down, the more is actually has to be included to justify the simple thing you are saying exists in this category of reality. So I just want to add those. I haven't put it together, and I'm hoping that Bard is up for the challenge. Thank you very much for your time.
All right. Thank you so much, Bonita. I took some notes. So what we're going to do, certainly after I'm going to hand it over to Bard, he's going to offer. One thing I will say, I hope for our conversation, is a naturalism, emergentism contrast. Maybe Bard will bring that. I found a lot I resonated with in what Bonita said, some questions that I had. I look forward to jumping in those, but we're going to hand it off to Alexander Bard, and let us have it, Bard.
Well, I'm kind of shocked at how much we agree. But I knew we would probably. But I think there's also a lot here in the nuance. And Bonita and I'm going to do the sales pitch right away. So it's done, because there's a fucking book here. It's non-profit, by the way. It's Process Event. It came out last year. And I realized I had to do metaphysics when I wrote this 6th book of mine. I had to sit down and do metaphysics, because the way we did human history could not be explained unless we had, an understanding of how we do universal history. So I had to go down to the dirty work of actually going into metaphysics for the book. Bonita and I had wonderful conversations this fall already. I really look forward to continue those. So I'm here with Bonita against John and Greg's. We have, it's Abba again. I'm Swedish. It's like Bjorn and Benny against Anne-Frid and Agneta. But it's like, but we had a wonderful conversation. She gets the book, and I really appreciate Bonita. She gets the book in the sense that I'm the son of Hegel and she's the daughter of Whitehead, And I've always found Hegel and Whitehead to be scarily compatible with each other. Hegel being still not understood in the Anglo-Saxon world, basically because we were all blinded by the enormous turn with Immanuel Kant, the Kantian turn, it's called in contemporary philosophy. But what happened was that only a few years later in Germany, there was another shock, at least on a par with the Kantian turn, which is the Hegelian turn. So I will return to Hegel and bring that into the conversation, because a lot of what John is asking for, and I totally agree, we have to do this turn and get out of the meta crisis. But actually, the work was done by Hegel and Nietzsche in the 19th century. It's precisely by reading Hegel and Nietzsche through each other. I worked on this for 30 years. I think we can see that there was a turn here. There was a turn away from dualism. The last dualism was, of course, Immanuel Kant, onto a monist worldview where the obsession is with difference. Okay, so everything relates to everything else in the universe. And I totally agree with John. Epiphenomenalism is just a dead end, because obviously my thinking relates my physicality too. It's just all the different things that exist affect everything else. So what we did in the book, there were 2 things. One of them is that we realized that 3 of the philosophical disciplines, and I'm a philosopher, I'm not a scientist. When I'm a scientist, I'm an economist, which I will totally leave out of this conversation. So the economist, Alexander Bard, you don't get to see him today. But I'm a philosopher and an artist. So allow me to be, if possible, maybe with Bonita here, even more of the philosopher. And then Gregg and John, who are fantastic scientists, can stay with the science. But my pointer is that we needed to look at the philosophical disciplines themselves. So being tired of doing ontology, because I actually find ontology to be quite easy. There's ontology and there's ontics. Essentially, that's what happened after Kant. So then everything starts moving and everything is relational, and that's Hegel. From Hegel through Nietzsche on to Whitehead and on to Deleuze, we have realized that everything is relational fundamentally. Although it's very difficult to think relationalism, it's absolutely necessary. The object out there is a byproduct of the relation. There are a lot that comes after the relation. So I think we all agree on that. But Hegel did too. The thing is with Hegel is that in his dialectical method, he just said that no, there is no fixed point anywhere in the universe ever. There's no individual. I'm a individual. I'm many different people. I was a different person yesterday than I am tomorrow. And by the way, I die all the time and I'm born all the time. Individuality is the normal state of things for us to be human. So this was already Hegel, because with his dialectical method, there is no fixed points. You must imagine that you live in a universe where you're not allowed to have a fixed point unless you know you're only having a fixed point to use it to then try to understand something. So it's like you borrow into that fixed point, and that's called negation in Hegel. So what we did was that we took ontology, epistemology, and phenomenology and threw them all into one big mess, which is what Hegel actually did. What he said was basically that ontology and epistemology and phenomenology are in themselves all three relational siblings in the world of philosophy. And he started doing ontology and epistemology at the same time, which is how he overcame Kant. Because in Kant, they were separate. And suddenly with Hegel, it's just like he cracks jokes at Kant all the time. He's just like, no, Kant. It's not like there's a phenomenon there and there's a noumenon there, because actually you are engaged and involved with the noumenon. So we call it phenomenology, just to crack a joke about it. Hegel constructed phenomenology. So the thing was that by doing this and calling it narratology, I think we come down to something that we can agree on is basically very human. Because in Hegel, there's a subject and there's a substance, and there's a subject's relationship to the substance, which is what philosophy is all about. There's always human subjectivity constantly returning in Hegel, and whenever you try to come up with anything without you being involved with the world, Hegel says, no way, that's cheating. Back to you again, because you are involved as philosopher or as partner of the philosopher or as human being. You are involved in the world, and we are humans. Philosophy is a human endeavor. So narratology enabled us to say that this is the trick with dialectics. Always have three. It's like I said, if you want to spice up your sex life, bring a third person into the bedroom. Highly recommend it. This is very Hegel. What Hegel does is that, no, dialectics is not the dichotomy or opposition between 2 points. Like if you have yin and yang, you must split either the yin or the yang. And Taoists actually do that, Bonita probably agrees, by splitting on the yang side. Always take the masculine side and make the split there, because men are so fucking schizophrenic anyway. Women are not. So you split on the side and say there's yang and there's yang within the yang. And then the yang is opposite the yin. This is how Hegel works all the time. So by using ontology and epistemology and phenomenology as 3 philosophical discourses, and then saying they're all 3 interconnected one another. And this is the Hegelian absolute. The Hegelian absolute is to recognize that, and to recognize there is no fixed point. And using vocabulary from the Greeks, we then say that there's a logos, and there's a pathos, and there's a mythos. Human beings have 3 different ways of describing reality, or describing the world, or make sense of the world. They use a logos, they use a mythos, and you use the pathos. And science, of course, is on the side of logos fundamentally. Pathos is just our emotional lives, our feelings, blah, blah, blah. There's no such thing in AI, by the way. Electricity is not blood. Let's put it that way. Mm-hmm. The pathos is incredibly human, animalistic, whatever, all the forces inside of you, the force of nature, pathical narratives. Newscasts, pornography, anything that's brutally real thrown at you is a pathical narrative. And then there's mythos, and mythos is actually, as often in Hegel, the go-between, meaning that since logos and pathos can never be unified in themselves as logos or pathos, you have to invent a mythos. And this is the temporary story about ourselves that human beings have to create all the time to make sense of the world. So Hegel allows us to have a temporary platform, which we agree, at least now we can agree. We have a paradigm, we have a certain historical period, we agree on certain values, we create a society together, and off we go, right? So to create that temporary platform, the mythos about ourselves, currently in the digital age with AI arriving and climate change and everything, to arrive at a mythos is what we need. The meta crisis is a lack of a new mythos. It's a nihilistic state where the old mythos is dead, It's not a death of a God. It's a death of a paradigm, and a new paradigm has to be installed. And we're in between paradigms, we're lost. Okay, so this moves us on to metaphysics. So what kind of implications does this narratological model have for metaphysics? Well, it means that, like you guys, the three of you here, I hate reductionism. Reductionism is the most silliest thing ever. Bonita just pointed out perfectly, so simply, by reducing the pizza to the wheat. It's idiocy, right? The problem is that, I don't know why, but especially the computer scientists who make all the technology today are all reductionist. And they tend to go to either reduction down to the sort of simplest monad, where apparently the entire history of the universe is pre-programmed or something. They go all the way down, they reduce everything down to some kind of atom, which would then explain everything else that happens afterward, because everything is then deterministic from that point, which I totally disagree with. But they also go the other way and say, well, I'm conscious and there's consciousness, and since I'm the center of the universe and I'm a fucking narcissist, and because I'm a computer scientist who just made billions of dollars, therefore everything has to be about me. So everything can be reduced to a consciousness. All I tell those guys is that here is a rock. Go and cuddle with a rock, have sex with a rock and talk to the rock, not with me. Apparently, because the rock has consciousness and you can talk to it, right? And off they go. So reductionism is the enemy, but it's fiendishly difficult to get rid of reductionism. I know all you guys here in the thread say, oh, relations. Yes, of course, relations, prior to a lot of our own relations. You have no idea how difficult it is to actually sit down and try to do relationalist philosophy. This is why it took geniuses like Hegel and Nietzsche to do it, and Whitehead to do it. And it's really, really hard. But okay, but if you try to do it, you got to remove all those things out there where you lose track. So what I'm proposing is that, I'm sorry, but the word nature is just the opposite of culture. And I'm defiant here. Nature is not superior to culture. They're just different emergences. Nature emerged and culture emerged. And like Gregg probably agrees with me, they're equal. If you're going to do metaphysics, don't do axiology when you do metaphysics. Leave axiology, you can do that later. It can be its own fourth story or whatever. Leave the axiology out. Just try to be as neutral as you can. Try to describe how the world functions. That's all you try to do here philosophically. That's metaphysics. So you say, okay, so where do I start then? Well, here's the great thing. Bergson. Bergson said, why is everybody obsessed why there's something rather than nothing? Because that's just interchangeable. Like you were nothing, then you were born, you were something, and then you die, you're nothing again. There's something and nothing all the time. That wasn't even a philosophical question. It's like a truism. And then Bergson said, what really strikes me with reality and with the universe is how much difference there is. God, there's so much difference and difference upon difference and difference between differences and differences all the time, which is relations. Relationalism is the obsession with difference. And I'm obsessed with it. So I start my philosophy right here and now with you guys. And then I said, what philosophy is concerned with, what metaphysics is concerned with, is that shit happens. And then the question is, what is shit? What kinds of shit are there? And what does it mean that something happens? Okay, then there's a great word for that, which is emergence. And we can then locate emergence as we temporarily say, emergence is like the most important happening that ever happened to us. So we sit here and describe the world in the 21st century. What is the most important thing that ever happened to us? And this is where Gregg got some of the ideas from, and Gregg and I started interchanging knowledge with each other a few years ago, is that it makes sense then to create these different emergences that have happened. Well, apparently some kind of big bounce or big bang, whatever happened, and physics came out of that, and we have chemistry and we have biology, and biology and physics is a hard problem to begin with. You don't need mind and matter to have a hard problem. The hard problem is everywhere, because if one thing is irreducible to something else, probably the problem is hard just because you're using the wrong language. If you use the language of biology to try to describe physics, you're going to go dead wrong. If you use the language of physics to try to describe biology, it won't work. So biology is just a different emergence vector compared to physics, a different emergence vector. I even allow chemistry one as well. And then we would on to say mind. And as Gregg says, the mind has produced culture, and culture is radically different from all the natures we had in the past. So we have a cultural emergence vector. So when we look at the world, we have these different emergence vectors. And then we could start make sense of each one of them independently by refusing to reduce any one of them to the other ones. Can you see how flat this becomes? So it's an emergentism to begin with. So this emergentism. Now here's the problem though. Something could happen, shit happens. Something could happen that forces us to rethink how we look at the world. It's happened in the past quite a few times. It seems even like every time a new paradigm comes. Right now, the internet came and took over the world, and we had satellites everywhere. We're all interconnected with each other, and AI comes along. And of course, we start seeing networks everywhere. And then we live in a network dynamical world all of a sudden. And then, of course, we say, well, everything is relations. Yeah, because to us now, here, network dynamical universe, to make sense of this, for me sitting here in Sweden talking to you guys like we're in the same room, magic. Yesterday's magic is tomorrow's technology. Magic. Okay, so the world changes, and our worldview has to change with it, and we're only human. That means the emergentism has to be transcendental. And here's the trick. It is so easy by a human mind which is stuck with reductionism to try to find rules and patterns for emergences. Say that, well, an emergence is objectively when these things happen, then it's emergence. And then Hegel and I just said, no way, baby. You can't do that, because if an emergence occurs, it wasn't pre-programmed. There was no creator God there who dictated beforehand what constitutes an emergence. It's like Hegel says, it's only in hindsight that we human beings construct the necessity of the past and say that because now with what we know now, that was an emergence, but that was not. Okay, that means the number one rule for transcendental emergentism is that it disqualifies any general emergency theory. There's no general concept of what an emergence is beforehand. What happens is that when a certain emergence happens, the entire theory has to be thrown out and reconstructed as a new transcendental emergentism. And that is a transcendentality. It's allowing us to completely change everything. Or like I say, when people say they don't believe in God, well, haven't waited long enough yet. Meaning God could come. Looking at AI, getting scared like God. And we might need God because we have invented the devil. We did August 6, 1945. We blew up a bomb over Hiroshima. The devil very much exists, and we invented the devil. So we have to do theology again and understand we did invent the devil. Where is God to save us from the devil, right? Now, if you do that, if you start to think about the world like that, there's incredible freedom in going for a transcendental emergency perspective. And why I use the word emergency rather than nature is because it's a purely metaphysical theory. Gregg and John are doing science, metaphysics for science. I respect that. But if you do a purely metaphysical theory, it's better to work with the emergence because it's absolutely neutral. It just says that shit happens. It says nothing else. It doesn't say nature. It doesn't say culture. And it says that if an emergence happens, and we in hindsight, we live in the 21st century will agree on that these things are the most important things that ever happened in history. And then we can start looking at these are the most important things that ever happened in human history, because civilization consists of these dramatic events that changed history forever. And we know how to live with the consequence of that. Hiroshima being one of them. Okay, that's an emergence, transcendental emergentism applied on human history. And then we can start understanding society. So that's essentially how you do metaphysics if you're a silly little philosopher like me, I guess.
All right. Thank you, each of you. I think we've gotten a very good summary of the various perspectives. I'll just put let me put a little UTOK spin. Then I'll invite John, Bonita, and Bart to just talk amongst themselves. Certainly, there are a lot I want to say, but I really want the three of you guys to have some dialogue. I want to remind folks, since we're here in UTOK land for the conference, that UTOK is situated in a particular kind of problem. And that is what I mentioned earlier in terms of like Bart is coming from a different place. It is very important to understand the situation of UTOK. And that's crucial to understand both its power and its limitations. Okay. It is structured to solve or it emerges out of a particular kind of justificatory problem, which presupposes the natural sciences and the kind of knowledge they're trying to generate. And how does it then relate to psychology as both the science and the subject? And UTOK then architecture is concerned with that, and it emerges as a naturalism as a function of that. That does not necessarily say that, that is where everyone should be situated, or a philosopher that takes a pure, proper metaphysical stance should be situated there. So I'll just say that in relationship to the UTOK stance. So I can hang with Bard and basically be like, oh, there's a different framing that we should be aware of. And if we have those framings, I think there's a lot of participatory dance that can be effectively take place. So I'll offer that. And it's a very similar comment in relationship to Bonita. And really, actually, then there's the synergy with John's view in particular. And I think that is a function of being psychologists, cognitive science, et cetera. So I'll offer that sort of as a synergistic, but I also want to get into some disagreements. I have some questions for both Bonnie and Bard, but I'm going to pause. I'm going to hand it back to John and see if where you want to take it, John, and then we can just go in some dialogue amongst the four of us and then start really bringing in some questions. Yeah, John, go ahead. Yep, I think, yeah.
Okay, there, thank you. Well, first of all, that was really rich and wonderful. I really welcome Alexander's. Everybody seems to be calling him Bard. Is that what you want? Okay.
Sometimes the Bard, but then yeah, well,
it makes me feel in high school. Teenage boys often use last names as opposed to first names. So at least in Canada, I don't know why we do that. First of all, I'm very happy to get into a discussion with Hegel. I've been doing. As you probably know, Bart, there's a renaissance about Hegel going on, and the work of Brandom, the work of Pinkard, the work of Farnath, Zambroga, all these people. I'm going through all of that literature. I'm going through it very carefully with Dan Chiappi, especially Hegel's binding of the notion of rationality into reciprocal recognition between individuals, not only synchronically, but intergenerationally. And I think that maps, by the way, very powerfully into current work on extended cognition, collective intelligence, things like that. So, you always need to ask, where's the agent that's doing the cognition? And I think Hegel gives us an alternative agency. He famously talks about the I that is we, that is I. And that's the kind of agency that is doing this more fundamental ontology. And I think in that sense, I'm in fundamental agreement with you, and then trying to work out, how does that agency operate? And I won't get into the details about that. I think that is a very significant problem. It's a problem that is now becoming central to 4E Cog Sci. So Hegel is coming in a very big way. So I think in that sense, we're in agreement. I'll speak about Whitehead in a second, and then I'll return to Bonita. I do have an issue with Hegel in that, and I think this comes out very clearly in Pinkard. Hegel talks a lot about the socio-cultural, cultural, historical processes that make the kind of persons, the kind of agents. We need all of these practices, as he repeatedly says, that makes us into the kind of cognitive agents that can recognize the inconsistencies within a particular way of life, a particular form of life. And of course, the phenomenology tries to trace both that out. The problem I have is I fear that at times Hegel verges on performative contradiction. He is using the propositional to try to point to the non-propositional. And he doesn't really give us a theory of practices or an ecology of practice, and that can't be just propositional. You, of course, have to use language, but you have to actually engage people non-propositionally. That is the way in which they learn practices. And I would put to Bonita, I think she's right. We don't ultimately get at reality through truth statements. We get at reality through processes, practices of realization. And that's where I would bring in what Bonita is talking about. I totally agree. We need ecologies of practices, because realization is how we get conform to reality as distinct from truth. And then the issue then comes up, okay, well, what does that look like? And I think this takes us into some work that's going on now about some of the work I'm doing about the deep at the heart of the rational. And I think this is already presaged in Hegel. You find ritual, you find rituals of recognition and forgiveness, and you find the generation of the spirit of trust. Farnath does that very well. And you have additional arguments for why at the heart of the rational we find ritual. We have to use all these imaginal things. Look, simple, one example of many. To be rational, I have to reflect on my own cognition. Oh, well, where do? Well, I go into this interior space. Was that a literal space? Well, no. Is it a merely fictional space? No, it gives you access to your cognition so you can correct it. But it's neither fictional nor literal. Well, what is it? It's imaginal. And you're engaging in ritual because you're seriously playing within an imaginal realm, I should say, in order to bring about the fundamental kinds of transformation in metacognition that is constitutive of rationality. So at the heart of the rational is ritual, but that doesn't mean that ritual is irrational. Ritual has a non-propositional rationality. It's not the rationality of coherence. It's the rationality of, is what you're doing in your ritual context, does it transfer systematically? Does it transfer broadly and deeply to many domains of your life? And does it transform you profoundly? Does it reach into many levels of the psyche and transform those? That when you get systematic transfer and systemic transformation, that's why rituals survive. That is how they survive. That's their rationality. That's how we judge a good ritual from a bad ritual. So you find the ritual and the rational mutually profoundly interpenetrating each other. And for me, that's where the work of the Kyoto school, especially Nishida, is so important, because Nishida develops, he follows the Zen ritual into the experience, I have to put that in serious quotations, of nothingness. And then he does explicitly, by the way, a Neoplatonic, investigation into the grounds of intelligibility. And he gets to the Basho, and he shows that the Basho and the Zen experience of nothingness are completely interdependent and interreliant. And you get basically Zen Neoplatonism. About Whitehead, I think I was just at the McGilchrist conference at the California Institute for Integral Studies. And of course, and Ian and I agree on, the right hemisphere is about the gestalt, and the left hemisphere is about the features. And I can give you all the features of the bird. That doesn't give you a bird. You need the gestalt. That's where the intelligibility actually hangs. And that's pure relationality. That's what the right hemisphere is about.
I'll just plug in real fast, John. Matt Siegel wanted to be here. He's actually at a conference. He sends love. And of course, we've talked to him and talked with him, Bonnie. And he's an excellent process philosopher. I'll just make that nod, as you mentioned.
Yeah. And I just want to finish very quickly. I don't want to monopolize. And then the thing there, of course, is the left hemisphere works with parts within a formal system and well-defined problems. Just getting a paper published now showing that you can't computationalize relevance realization, because the process of formalization, the process of translating things into a formal system, is not itself a well-defined problem, and it can't therefore be grasped by a formal system. Formalization is not a computational function. It is no way of running a formal system. And so you get that the right hemisphere has priority, and the right hemisphere is about pure relationality. And Ian and I fundamentally agree on that. The reason I bring that up is Filler, in his astonishing book, Heidegger, Neoplatonism and the History of Being, makes the argument, and Matt Segal and the other people, the Whiteheadians, agreed that Whitehead is basically running an argument that was developed by the later Neoplatonist, about pure relationality, about emergence and emanation. What Whitehead adds that I think James, I know Filler personally, what James misses is that process of that I think both of you are putting your finger on, which is the radical creativity. And I think that's what Bard wanted to point out too. The many become one, and then one is added. That drawing together of all the widths isn't just a stagnant interrelationality. It's pregnant. It creates a newness, a novelty. And what I want to add to that is that means we have to introduce into our ontology radical uncertainty. If you have radical emergence, in which you can't predict the emergence, but there is some novelty introduced, you are facing radical uncertainty, which means by definition, no formal system can ultimately track reality, because formal systems require the exclusion of uncertainty. So if there really is radical creativity, which is what I think Whitehead adds to the Neoplatonists, and I think what Bard is pointing to, we face an ontology in which uncertainty is not just an epistemic matter. It's not equivalent to probabilistic risk that we can calculate. It is radical uncertainty, which then means we cannot grasp it with a formal system. And I think that's convergent with what Bardes was saying. And I think that's also part of picking up on what Bonita was, I think, pointing to. And I'll end my responses there. There's 17,000 more things I want to say, but I was interested in also. I think sacredness is the bridging notion between the ultimacy of ontology and the ultimacy of axiology. The sacred is that which is most valuable, but it is also bound to what is most real. And I was trying to make an argument that if you get to this ultimate reality, you have the triple transcendent, which gives you sacredness. And I think if you have sacredness with unformalizability that is realized, I should say, not captured, wrong word, that is realized in a set of practices, I think you're very much into what religion was doing for us. That would be my response.
Lovely. Okay, so how about I hand it over to Bonita and see what thoughts she wants to pick up on. Then we'll really open it up, folks. You can use a question and answer chat. I see one in there already. I'll also check the chat box for this. And I know we'll come in, but I want to give Bonita and Bard an opportunity to respond to that. You guys certainly ask each other questions as well. And I'll be checking the Q&A as well. So Bonita, thoughts?
Yeah, this is so fecund. So as John said, there's a million things to go through. I want to say, this may be a little bit of plug, but I am on the last panel, and we'll have a chance to talk about my conception of God. So I'm going to leave that part out, although it would be nice to just put that here. And I want to talk about what I think. First of all, I have to say this because I have to kind of tease Alexander Bard. Okay, so Bruno Latour wrote this book, Speculative Grace, and it really sounds very much like you, like creating religion with a flat ontology. And I just think only a true genius like Bard could use Hegel as an icon for a flat ontology. So so that was genius, so brilliant. But I guess what I want to do is kind of perform what I think Whitehead is doing. And that is everything we said about the difference between the true and real. So that's the bird chair. And then he says, so then what do I have? What do I have to experience reality? And basically, what he boils it down to is I have what the Buddhists would call self-validating experience of the real. And this is a feeling. The most fundamental way I can express what this experience is a feeling that things are real. And so from this, he says, as I interpret him, as in my fantasy of being with Whitehead, he then says, well, if this is, so instead of having like a metaphysical ground, this is what I truly believe is the most fundamental thing I can say about myself. And then he makes this leap. This is the metaphysical leap. Maybe all of reality works on this template. What if all of reality, maybe it's not just a coincidence that my experience is that this self-validating feeling that something is real. And in this feeling, it self-validates two things. And this is where the transcendent comes in. It validates that my experience is real and replete. It is whole and full, but it also validates that it's not complete, that there's a remainder in the cosmos. And this creates the sense that there is more reality. So this is extremely important experience. And I believe this is the kind of experience that sustained Whitehead's work. I've never read a biography of him, but that it rings true to me. And I just want to combine this with something that Diana Fascia says. She's a student of Panelist, and she talks about the clinical experience of transformance, that the psychologist and the client are working toward this, what she calls, she says it's an evolutionary arc that's deeply wired in humans for transformance. And that truth in this sense, which is reality, is this trust, or it comes from the word troth or trust. It's this inner understanding of clarity that is the marker for awakening of perception. It emerges from awakened perception as a core truth or trust. To trust to truth is to behold. And so I think that these kinds of languages, these kinds of confidence in the human experience is a potential a potential point at which we can begin to investigate and share and sing and celebrate the confidence of the real, and share this peculiar sense that the real is always never complete, and there's always a latency in our experience. So that's what I'd like to put in this space.
That's awesome. I did not expect Diana Fascia to pop up. I'm a fan of hers, AEDT, and that's accelerated experiential dynamic approaches. And it is absolutely the case that modern emotion-focused elements, Gestalt frameworks, to me, the word that I would definitely want us to hit here is primate-mindedness. Okay, the mind, the idea that the mind is a propositional reflector that's going to represent, and that's what's split off, is one of the, to me, deep errors of the Enlightenment. Mindedness is the embodied contact, and clinically, what we see so much of is a disconnect, a fundamental propositional disconnect. You can argue, certainly McGilchrist, John, and saying modern society in part is propositionally personhood disconnected from the primate embodiedness. And so much of what we do clinically is attempt to connect to that in a relational space that creates a shared, non-propositional, intersubjective, I'd call it a mind to be space to connect to the real. It's so lovely to see that bridge happen in terms of me as a clinician. That's sort of an unexpected turn, so I just had to prop in there. Let me hand it over to Bard, and then we'll really start to engage in question and answer from the audience and whatnot. Bard, do you want to
just two quick responses to Bonita and Gregg, because we've been in a lot of conversations. And with Bonita, this is Whitehead at his Hegelian best. And please remember, I use Hegel for method. Hegel was wrong on many things. John can be sure of that. He was wrong on many things, but he was brilliant when it comes to method, because with Hegelian dialectics, we arrive in Western philosophy with a complete set of how to think relationalism. And Whitehead just does the same thing. And that remainder, that's exactly the negation within the subject in Hegel. So you have those things there. So perfect, Bonita. And as for you, Gregg, this is why I am, as a psychoanalyst, I am fighting to get psychoanalysis out of the ditch of science, because as a science, psychoanalysis failed miserably in the 20th century, but it took off and became a philosophical discipline. And as a philosophical discipline, the 20th century was anthropology became philosophy, it was psychoanalysis became philosophy, and most of all, to do Hegel, I had to do Marshall McLuhan first, because there's no media theory in Hegel. Hegel thinks ideas develop over time. No, they don't. What develops is, of course, again, relations between human beings and different technologies. And because different technologies develop over time, they change the life world we're in. And we actually tend to take to the technologies that improve in our lives rather than the ones that make them more miserable. And because we do that, we can then expand. We can learn how to read, write, and count, and we can mass duplicate and do kinds of amazing things we do. And that's exactly why I think Hegel is only method and nothing else. Leave Hegel for the rest. That's exactly why Marx and Darwin, the other guys that came after Hegel, material, all went to the material real world and then threw it at Hegel with the dialectical method. But the method is great. So this is why I'm a great fan of Gregg, and where I'm involved with the UTOK, is it called UTOK? UTOK, yeah. UTOK is great. UTOK, because I really believe psychology needs a reformation. It needs a massive reformation. It gets stuck as a service to governments, basically to fix people, to send them back to work over the past 50 to 100 years. And what I loved about Gregg's passion was the fact that he said, I'm a psychologist. I'm going to take psychology seriously. I'm going to do what Aristotle meant with psycho and logos and do real psychology. And this is exactly why I totally support the attempt to do a proper psychology as a science, which of course then connects to John's work as a cognitive scientist. These are great sciences. We need more of them. Okay. So for me to do psychoanalysis is now to do strictly an art. It's nothing but an art. It's a philosophical art. For me, psychoanalysis, performing it with people, is basically taking the entire history of philosophy down to one single human being and then put their individuality into philosophical perspective. It's teaching people how to do a philosophy about themselves. That's what psychoanalysis is. So psychoanalysis, I work today with psychiatry and I work today with psychologists. What I do is that I arrange teams here in Stockholm where there's psychologists, there's psychiatrists, and there's a psychoanalyst. And there are three different perspectives looking at human beings. And it's stunning how quickly we can get to results and solve problems and give people a quality of life and heal, right? So I'm all for this. Again, narratology, like I told you, when you have a dialectical relationship between three things, it's usually very, very productive. Don't try to unify them into one thing. Don't try to turn logos, pathos, and mythos into one thing. Keep them separate. Live with the dichotomies. This is Hegel. Live with the dichotomies, and it's going to be productive and it's going to be great. Okay. Now I want to respond to John, because I'm just going to write a word down here in the chat channel. Got to put my glasses on and write it down, because this is the next project I'm involved with and I'm thrilled about. It's probably my 7th book and everything else I'm doing. Zoofism with a Z. So here's the take. When I started traveling to Asia in the 1980s and realized that religion and philosophy had to meet again and Eastern spirituality was amazing, and I was totally with Ken Wilber, that it would be embarrassing for my generation of philosophers to start with the Greeks once over again. No, it didn't start with the Greeks. The Greeks just wrote a lot. The Arabs saved their texts, and the Arabs saved the text for us. And then we, in hindsight, we made up the Greek system, the cradle of civilization, whatever, and this sort of mythology about Europe. Josephine Quinn's new book, How the World Made the West, amazing book, better than Sapiens or whatever. It's the biggest, best history book ever written by a woman from the UK, and it just kills the idea that Greece started civilization. So what I did instead was that I started looking into Asian philosophy, and I started looking into the Indian and the Chinese and Japanese and the Persian traditions. And then I discovered that the Persian tradition is the origin of Greek philosophy. The word philosophia is from about 600 before Christ. It was used already by Indo-Iranians 1100 years earlier as Masdayasna in Avestan Persian, which means the love of wisdom. Basically, the Greeks just borrowed. And here the key is Heraclitus. So for all these things about Neoplatonism and Zen, if you look at the Silk Road and you look at the Silk Road Triad, as I call it, which is the traditions of Buddhism with Shaivism as well in India, and then you got Zoroastrianism and Zoroastrianism in Persia, and then you got Taoism in China. Then you got all these different spiritual schools that would never really fought with each other, no recorded conflicts whatsoever. Basically, just went from one oasis town to the next along the Silk Road, and you found slightly different variations of the same spiritual themes. Trade routes, great. Whatever spirituality we go into next historically as human beings, we should definitely look at the trade routes for inspiration, because these religions are non-dogmatic. They're spiritual schools. They're full of practices. They're full of rituals, and they basically fix our lives every day. So we get rid of the destructive bullshit in our mindset, drop it somewhere, and stay with the constructive mindset and build on that. And so when I studied Zoroaster, the original text, the Gathas and the Zendavesta, translated by Germans in the 19th century, I discovered, wait, this is exactly Heraclitus. Heraclitus said the Greeks should not be Greeks. Heraclitus said, we're Persians. We're part of the Persian Empire. What's wrong with being Persian, right? Heraclitus maybe even was Persian. But the thing with Heraclitus is that by comparing Heraclitus fragments with Zoroaster's Gathas, which I did 30 years ago, I discovered this is going to be the gold mine I'm going to work from. And what I'm now doing, the project we're doing now, is basically the Z in Zoofism is, of course, Sufism, be taking back Sufism from its origin. Sufism, taking it away from Islam. Sorry, guys, but you didn't invent this. You always hated it and you always badmouthed it because it was monist and all those things that we love. So basically, Sufism is a monist reinterpretation of Sufism as older than Islam. And we then discover that this is exactly where Zoroastrianism and Buddhism met. And Zoroastrianism and Buddhism met in contemporary Central Asia. And of course, out of that, we got Bodhidharma, who was not a prince from India, who was a trader from Sogdia. We got Padmasambhana, who is not an Indian prince. He was another trader. He came from Tajikistan today, and he came to Tibet. So Vajrayana and Zen are just, to me, drenched in Persian philosophy as much as they're Chinese or Indian. And these are the richest traditions I can find in the world today. So if I'm going to do religion and philosophy and go back 5,000 years and go to find the gold mines and do whatever we can do today to understand ourselves and our history as humans, this is the gold mine I'm totally obsessed with. I can't do Peru and Mexico too. Other guys have to do that. But I am totally obsessed with Eurasian and with heritages. And I think where John and I are both heading, maybe this is the future where we can go into conversation future. I think we're heading is that if I pursue Sufism, I mean, when John just mentioned the Kyoto school, tears came out of my eyes right away. I mean, these are my months I spent in Zen temples in Korea and Japan. This is exactly what I love the most about this conversation. So I'm just dropping the word Sufism for the first time here because my team here in Scandinavia agreed. We call each other Sufis now. You can call it Zen Sufis if you like, but we are practicing now and living a Sufism. And we're obviously finding other Sufis out there around the world who also manage to live with this sort of monist spiritual tradition with daily practices. So just want to put that out there. And then say that Neoplatonism, maybe then John can dig deeper or whatever. I don't get too stuck with the Neoplatonist. I love Hellenism. I think Hellenism was the most fantastic thing ever. But for me, it's actually deeper. I think before Plato, we go before Plato with the pre-Socratics, we discovered they did philosophy of flux. They did relationalism. Mm-hmm. Relationalism is the oldest philosophy. It's rather later when, the Greeks start thinking and mathematics comes into the picture, Pythagoras and everything. And they're so infatuated with mathematics, they think, well, there could be perfect forms out there. Well, that's an interesting idea, but it's not actually how the world operates. Today, it's the computer scientists with zeros and ones. And if they have billions of dollars to think they're philosophers, we're in a really dangerous spot. So we have to respond to that whole sort of computer science attempt to turn the world into zeros and ones and nothing but zeros and ones and create this sort of deterministic nightmare that comes out of it, and respond to that with what John perfectly calls the radical uncertainty. The radical uncertainty is Hegel's, we are terrified of our freedom because the future is completely contingent. It is the past which is a necessity because the past is locked up. History is, in Hegel is like a zigzag. So everything the zigzag is the past. Don't change that. Amor fati, Nietzsche said, just accept that whatever happened, happened. That's factual truth. But the future is completely, scarily contingent and open, and we are active agents engaged in the future. And for me, that's being a Sufi. So I'll leave it at that.
Oh, lovely. John, you want to respond to that? And then I'll take some questions from the audience.
Yeah, Bard, you may be pleased to know that the next big series I'm working on, and it's going to be titanically bigger than my previous two. I'm going to go on location. It's going to be at different levels of media presentation, a macro, a meso, and a micro. Is called The Philosophical Silk Road, in which I actually pick up the proposal. Now I talk about Zen Neoplatonism, but we can quibble about things like that. I think Neoplatonism plays a role in Sufism too, but I don't want to get mired in a historical argumentation here. I think the orientation is very much aligned, and true to my criticism of Hegel, I'm not going to merely talk about this. This has become a personal pilgrimage for me. I'm going through a purgation process right now that I have not called for, but has called me, in which I'm fundamentally preparing to actually go to these places and be transformed by looking at the past, but by also drenching myself in what I call the geophilosophy and the culture and the history. And so making myself a vehicle, that's too pretentious, at least putting myself in service of the advent of the sacred that is happening right now in response to the meaning crisis. But it seems like what you are talking about and what I'm talking about, though not identical, are deeply convergent. So I just wanted to reply to that. That's the next big project.
Right. So that's really lovely. And actually, there's a question from Victor. So I'm going to go to some Q&A. I'll see if I can pick it up in the chat if there are other kinds of elements. If Victor wants to unmute, he can read this, or I will read it for him. I think it's a fascinating question. wait a second. I'm not sure. Why don't I go ahead and read it, Victor, if you're around, and you can unmute and then you can dialogue. And so here's the question. Our being in an emergence pervades our collective awareness, gestured at as a time between worlds. How can a philosophy of transcendental emergentism inform science such that the preferable emerges? Like, where do we want to go? What do we cultivate? What's the relationship, I think, between facts and values? Is there a direction where we're cultivating preferable? I hope I don't put too many words in Victor's mouth, but I'll throw that out there and see if somebody wants to pick up. What are we oriented toward? What are we trying to do? Inform a science? I would also wonder also about practices, etc.
I would first of all say that one of the things that comes out of this, and Pickstock does a lot of work on this, and so does Filler, but other people I've mentioned Casebeer, Putnam, some of my own work. The fact-value distinction, the is-ought distinction, is breaking down. It doesn't mean there aren't differences, but they're differences like the difference between two colors, right? They're on a continuum of degree, and they're not differences in kind. You can't actually ever state a fact that is not simultaneously a value judgment. You can't make any value judgment that is not simultaneously a statement of fact. They are non-logically identical, but they are inseparably, interpenetratingly bound to one another. And I think as long as we still frame this as we have to solve the is-ought problem, no. I don't often invoke Wittgenstein, but here's where I think Wittgenstein is appropriate. We don't solve the is-ought problem. We are in a place now where we dissolve it. And then we get back to an ontology that allows us for a profound connectedness to reality. And I think for me, any way forward that doesn't prioritize that connectedness to the religio in a way that is, rationally self-transcending, rationally self-correcting, all that sort of stuff, all the stuff we've been talking about here. And that's part of what Hegel was on about. It is rationally self-correcting. It's just not strict syllogistic logic, right? Because the process is to be self-correcting, or you can't distinguish foolishness from wisdom. But I think for me, what comes out of this, and I can make a deeper argument, but wise love, agapic love, like what is guiding you to loving more wisely, and what is allowing you to love wisdom in an interpenetrating manner. I think if people are looking for a practical normativity to guide them in practice, that's important. And then one other thing I would say is give up the monological standpoint. The evidence is now overwhelming. We reason better collectively than we do individually. Experimental evidence is merging. And this is what I would say, not pushback on Bart. I think this is amplification. The dialectic has to be accompanied with a dialogos, which is dialogical practice, because that gives you the cognitive agent that is actually capable of doing this new kind of realization of a new kind of ontology. In which fact and value are no longer separate, in which theory and data are no longer separate, in which analytic and synthetic are no longer separate, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Bart is right. This is hard, but it is already happening. And I think we should orient to the places. Here is one of them, and there are many others where it's happening, and we should do our best to culturally try to bind all these places and practices together. That would be my recommendation.
I agree totally with John here. It's just called narratological dialectics in my lingo, but it's exactly the same thing. So it's very humbling to understand how dialectics works, and you can't arrive at a fixed point anytime. I think the really scary thing right now out there is that the people who were dogmatic have gone fundamentalist and gone hysterical, as we're seeing in the Middle East right now. That's terrifying, especially if these guys have access to atomic bombs and can blow us all up. That's a very, very real threat. And the reason why they go hysterical is because fundamentalism is like the end state of something that's already dead. It's like, imagine an ideology which is zombie-like. It's just almost dead. So the last thing you do is that if God does not intervene in the world as he should do according to your dogma, you have to act on God's behalf. The scary thing right now with Islam and Christianity is they might get the Armageddon they prophesied about, but it's all self-made. This is terrifying. This is very, very real. My recommendation then is to say the revolution is currently completely on the technological side, and that's scary because the revolution is going haywire right now and needs to be contained. For me as a human, that means I react exactly the opposite way. I retract. The most radical thing to do as a human today is to retract, like John so wisely says, like we all do here, retract, step back, go into retreat, observe the world from the outside. And it's about love. It's about love. It's about finding that spot where that love is and feeling, be human, right? This is why we can't do philosophy without spirituality any longer. It's another dead end. But what I'm saying is that what Hegel did is that he basically said his absolute is on the meta level, precisely because he doesn't allow any absolute on the formal level. That's exactly why Hegel is great in the sense that he says that the only absolute I have is that there is no absolute, in the sense that there is only movement and flux all the time. And all we can do then we try to think those fluxes are dialectical processing and dialectical thinking. And that's what we can do, to not arrive at any fixed point, only at temporary solutions to temporary problems. And that's what we do all the time. That means it's incredibly anti-dogmatic. That's the whole point. And the anti-dogmatism is exactly what we need more of the world today. Whenever you can, if you're going to be a missionary about anything today, you're going to be a missionary about anti-dogmatic. Go anti-dogmatic and dissolve these dogmas out there because they're the ones that are really affecting us.
Amen. Bonnie, did you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I wanted to ping on what was where John and Bard were talking about philosophy is dialogic. And then I saw a question pop up in the chat. Could Bonnie give us examples of fierce naturalism? So I can kind of answer, build on the dialogic by answering with what I would call fierce naturalism. Okay, so on the one hand, on one level, I completely agree that philosophy is dialogical, but I think the fierce naturalism would say yes, but not dialogic at the level of words and thinking with thoughts. And this is where, if you think of the concept of a stack, I think that, so for example, if you can imagine atoms are dialogical, they're resonant with each other. There's either constructive or deconstructive interference. And this is a kind of feeling between them, resonance. And then we get to sentience. And sentience is a dialogue through touch. So the worm oscillating in an ordered environment is touching the environment. So that's I touch. And then we have cognizance, where these are gestures. These are physical, emotional, affect-laden gestures at the animal mind level, let's say. And that's dialogic. Gestures are dialogic. Gesture is touch at a distance. And then we get into the Hellenistic and the lyrical philosophies, pre-Socratic philosophies, where people are saying or singing. So this is a call and response, the Psalms and the lyric Hellenistic philosophy. So you just feel what this is. This, I touch, I gesture, I say, I sing. Then you get into the great epic of Gilgamesh and the narratives of the Iliad and the Odyssey. And now we're right at the heels of the Socratic time, and this is when we're starting to tell. So instead of like lyrical and saying saying and a call and response, you have someone telling the whole history of the people, the whole history of Troy and the whole history, and these become so there's a reduction in the dialogical nature at this point in history. And then with the Socratics, I would argue that becomes I name. So instead of telling a story of a man who was courageous, but also an asshole to his wife, and all these kind of very complex ways in which humans and nature show up as in the allegories, we start to say, well, that's too confusing. We never see a real courageous man because sometimes he's not courageous. So let's extract and isolate these virtues, these variables from reality, and name them. And this is, I think, where the next phase is now we name, then we're going to compute, okay? So I see this progression that the telling and then the naming is a bottleneck. And so we go from sentience, cognizance, consciousness to reflexive awareness. And this is where we get to I tell, I name, I compute. It's the progressive simulation of the self. And then we start dialoguing with the self. And I think this is a bottleneck. So what we're doing, and we call it lyric culture, is now we want to move from reflexive awareness to receptive awareness. So there's an opening, as John describes very well. I see with the eye of the soul. This is kind of a Gnostic insight. And then you go from receptive awareness to open awareness. So receptive awareness, you still have the sense that you're receiving perceptions, and open awareness is more like I'm feeling. And so we're back to this Whitehead's insight that there's a resounding resonance of feeling that I am embedded in. I'm not just receiving it. And then this is all a methodology. And then from there you get the sense of the I am. And this is the transcendent sense of the radiant being of reality, or the radiance being the radiance of God, or the radiance of the divine. And you find that within yourself. And the naming, the telling and the naming and the computing are in the wrong direction. We have to dial that back and move toward receptive awareness, open awareness, and this sense of original radiance, which you might say is how the universe started. So that's kind of like a fierce naturalism take on this conversation. And I thank you for the opportunity to put it on the table. It's not completely resonant with what else we've been talking about.
Okay. What I'd like to do now is I've got another question, a second one that came up. This is from Spencer. I'll read it. Spencer, certainly feel free to pop in, but I'll read this. This is actually directed at Alexander Bard. How do you feel about the idea that Hegel needs to be read together with Schelling and later Fichte, 1804 plus, to be fully relationally understood? For instance, to fully read Hegel with Whitehead and Deleuze. That's where the question ends. If Spencer wants to, so where does Hegel fit with?
Okay. Yeah, okay. But that's been done. That's been done a lot. Hegel is put together with the German idealists, and he's not an idealist. He's really a dialectician. The way I do Hegel is I do Hegel's method, and then I provocatively call myself a pan-dialecticist. I think fundamentally everything in the universe, the only thing I can say about all the different emergence vectors is that they all seem to have some kind of a dialectical quality to them. So I just call myself a pan-dialecticist. Then I've learned the lesson from Hegel. No, what wasn't done is the weird artificial opposition between Hegel and Nietzsche. When I started reading the guys in my teenage years, it was like, they're compatible. They're perfectly compatible. I mean, Nietzsche's amor fati, which is his, axiology, it's just where his values start from, is exactly like Hegel's the necessity of the past. And scared of the contingency of the future and the freedom is exactly affirmation in Nietzsche. They're perfectly compatible. And I'm glad the whole new generation today, at least here in Europe, they're all reading Hegel and Nietzsche through each other, which is incredibly productive to get all the best usage bits out of these amazing 19th century thinkers. Then when you start looking at the 20th century, I found Whitehead, who I love to bits, and he also does relationalism. And it's almost like Whitehead. Deleuze, of course, later in France, in the late 20th century, Deleuze does the same thing with Guattari in France, and they're amazing thinkers. I love Deleuze and Foucault and Guattari. These are the guys I grew up with. But Deleuze's attempt at trying to do Hegel as if Hegel did not exist is exactly what Whitehead actually did. Whitehead did Hegel as if Hegel did not exist, and then applied on the natural sciences and mathematics and tons of stuff that Hegel was not aware of, which is why I think Whitehead is fantastic. So I prefer to use the Hegelian method and read it through the 20th century thinkers, and then try to read it through us and try to read it through 20th century philosophy, what the Hegelian method could mean today. But as method, it is amazing. And I'm so glad that John, who's so fantastic, is now going to put his head on to Hegel, because the day Vervaeke goes on Hegel, that's going to be enormous.
Okay. I've got a question here from Kevin Katwas. And this question is, how does an ontology of pure relationality relate to the emerging digital network decentralized institutions of the future? How does a ontology of pure relationality relate to an emerging digital network and decentralized institutions of the future?
I guess that's kind of my question again. Anyway, it's the paradigm we're in right now is the network dynamical paradigm. Some call it digital, some call it the internet, some call it AI, whatever. What happened is the technology now is going global. We got satellites everywhere. Everything is interconnected. The threat here is to arrive in a surveillance police state. We don't want that. So I'm totally with decentralization and try to think, how can we still have a network dynamical society with all its benefits, but still lived in a decentralized way? That's a fiendishly difficult question to solve. It's a typical axiological question today. So we are network because
I've got a question here from Cody Palmer.
Just finish that.
Does a Neoplatonic framework create an ontological structure that is isomorphic?
Greg, can you hear us? Greg, I think he couldn't hear you, Alexander. I think that's the problem.
All right.
Greg, are you still there?
He looks frozen.
Yeah. That's Alexander. Just hang on a sec. I think that's what happened there. I don't think he was being rude. I think he thought you'd stopped.
Yeah. I could just finish the answer and so he can get word back. Because the rest of you are all here, right? It was just Greg's problem, right? Okay.
Yeah.
He'll be back. So I'm just going to finish the question. The thing is that I'm with Marshall McLuhan, an amazing philosopher, by the way, in that the media we use reflect our thinking.
I have to show you this, because the last time you said him, have you read his religion book, The Medium and the Light? Oh, okay.
Oh, yeah. I mean, if anybody's going to save the Pope, it's going to be Marshall McLuhan, the best Catholic in the world, right? But it's the thing is that the media we use will also affect how we think. And that's why this sort of minoritarian thinking that Hegel and White had practiced at the time is now becoming majoritarian. We're all starting to think like they think because we live in a world drenched in network relations, and we try to figure out how relations must work. And it's fantastic to live in a relationless universe, so why not? But that's why relationalism is becoming such a big topic, because it actually reflects the technological environments we are in right now.
I'd like to answer to that too, then, while we wait for Greg to come back. And I think this is actually convergent with what Bart is saying. What you still have, and this goes to what we're now in what's called the fourth rationality debate. We've had a whole bunch. What is rationality? You still have people claiming that this can ultimately be grasped in an a priori axiomatic system, all of this. And that is kind of the epistemological version of the zombie fundamentalism that Bart was pointing to, but within a scientific framework. And part of what we try to argue in two papers, one is rationality and relevance realization, the other one is naturalizing relevance realization, is that project is actually doomed. You can't do it that way. It's not that there aren't top-down aspects, but you can't step out. This is Hegel. You can't step out and give an a priori top-down, right, optimization that will work algorithmically across all possible contexts. This is the last ditch attempt that is being made in order to wrestle with the network reality and the dynamic system reality we're realizing here. I think that is a kind of scientistic fundamentalism that is strongly analogous to a lot of religious fundamentalisms that we have. But because they typically don't blow up buildings or whatnot, they don't get the deserved attention. But if you don't think these people are going to cause terrific suffering if they succeed, I think you're being foolish. So I would want to point out that there is an attempt to recapture all of what Bart was pointing to, right, about network dynamics in a top-down, a priori, axionomic formal systemization. And I think this is the last-ditch attempt. And so I think that has to be properly challenged and resisted. I've been trying to do so, by the way. And I think other people are.
I totally agree with John. Here's why. That's why I said surveillance police state.
Yes.
And this book, Process and Event, is a manifesto against that happening. The scientist fundamentalists are going to go for the surveillance police state, and they're going to do good in the world. It's like vulgar Platonism. They're going to go for the good in the world by controlling absolutely everything. Well, that's already happening because Xi Jinping is trying to do it in China with vulgar Confucianism. Because vulgar Confucianism is exactly what vulgar Platonism is. And these are the two heritages we got in Eastern and Western thinking we need to get rid of once and for all. We call them the pillar saint ideologies. The pillar saint ideologies is like Confucianism and Platonism at its worst. It's the little 11-year-old boy who threw his wonderful little idea that if everybody did everything the way I think they should do, the world would be wonderful and everything would be a sunny day forever. And they're there. Most computer scientists I meet, when they start to think about philosophy, their mind gets stuck there. I think it's great that you mentioned it here, John. Scientific fundamentalism is scientistic fundamentalism is the right term for that. And it's just as scary as the other fundamentalism, especially these guys have so much power and influence today. We've got to avoid the surveillance police state precisely because we need an open society. Without an open society, all freedom is gone.
All right. Hey, folks, I'm back. It looks like we have Scott has got a question. I'm noting the time here. Why don't we ask Scott a question? We'll respond to that, and then we'll congeal, give some final thoughts, and then we'll end the session that way. Scott?
Thank you very much. I appreciate having the opportunity to open my mic. I tried to type the question and it blew up. Alexander, I very much appreciate your rich, bold understanding of Hegel. And if we're going to talk about Hegel and Whitehead and be serious about process ontology, then stability becomes a scale relative phenomenon. In other words, one of the things confirm your speaking language. Hold on. Okay, hold on. Okay. There you go. Okay, sorry, I got to think the Zoom thing I had to answer. Question I have is this: in my work, I look at the things you described, where we went wrong with thingism, why it's difficult to think relationally. One of the artifacts of the way dynamical systems work is that stable states emerge relatively in a dynamic space. So they're transient. Yet we've confused the stability with the fixedness. Our thoughts come to be as temporally stable states that come and go in a hyper-complex neural dynamic. Our words are the same. So I think I just want to get your reaction to the idea that we've confused the stable states that our brains necessarily create to have things we call thoughts. We've confused those stabilities with the way the world is, not seeing the actual multi-scale dynamic work that makes the emergence of temporarily stable states possible. I know that was a lot, but I had to ask that of you, given your talk.
Totally agree. That's why the book is called Process and Event. In a very, very, very fundamental, rudimentary addressing of the problem of the East and the West, where East and West can learn, is that the East got stuck with process. And I've never met a Chinese or an Indian intellectual who didn't agree with me. They got stuck with the process. The problem was that in Western culture, especially through Islamic Christianity, we got so obsessed with the event and we forgot about the process. What then happened is that the event itself becomes endlessly repeated. Christ on the cross all the time, Muhammad storming Mecca all the time, every year again and again, same whip on the back. The problem is that reality is process and event. Being human is process and event, East and West, man and woman, dialectical relationships all the way down. And I'm just basically advocating, if you can think that the event is the stability and it's temporary, remember it's temporary, so you can use it and build from, but then things will move on and the new process will start. Then what happens is you realize that processes are repeated, but the process is never identical to the previous lap of the process. That tiny little difference enables you to create an event and change history forever in a new constructive direction. I think that's a wonderful thought that any engineer I ever met is thrilled about hearing, because they try to find that little spot where they can improve on the world every day when they work. So process and event, that's what the book's called that. That's a unity of the two.
All righty. That's lovely. Let me offer a few thoughts first off. First off, thank you all for a really stimulating hour and 45 minutes. My heart is filled with joy to stay at the primate level. the exchange of ideas, the feeling in the room was really good. Couple things I want to mention. One is, let's make sure we're clear about where we're locating, how we're entering into this. And certainly UTOK's location is explicit. I appreciated our exchange being clear where John's coming from. I think where Bonita's coming from. Understanding where we're entering, and then to see the convergence through those various elements, to me is really inspiring and fascinating. Another area of convergence I want to mention with Bard is that narratology, with its logos, pathos, and mythos, has lots of parallels with UTOK's epistemological pillars of the tree of knowledge, the Equog coin, and the garden. That's really a logos, pathos, mythos frame of reference. I also want to speak to some of what obviously I share with John and our hope for transcendent naturalism, at least in relationship to a strong transcendence of a collective emergence, a collective intelligence that transforms the onto-epistemological relation. I think that's desperately needed. And the last thing I'll say in relationship to Bonnie is the embodiment of being, contact with the cutting through metaphysics down into the experience of being, to me is absolutely central, and we've lost that in many ways. And to regain that is aspects of the core of the task as I see us moving forward. So all of these things to me are connecting in particular ways. They're inspiring. They're spurring lots of thoughts. I'll go to John, and then Bonnie and Bard can have the last word, and then we can wrap up. John, any final thoughts you want to share as we kind of bring this to a close?
I found this tremendously fecund, and I'm always impressed when there's considerable convergence, and it's convergence, and there's enough difference so we're not just echo chambering. Convergence requires that there's real difference, although they come to shared conclusions. Maybe resolutions is a better word, because that raises the plausibility of the overall framework dramatically. If Bonita working, I'm not claiming we're completely independent of each other, that's ridiculous, but she's working independently, Bard is working independently. There's significant enough differences between what we're saying that we're not just echoing each other. And yet, as we unfold our particular argumentative paths, we come to very similar kinds of realizations. I think that raises the overall plausibility. And so I would say that if you listen to the Geist between the three of us, you actually get the best possible argument for what is needed right now.
Lovely. Bonnie?
Yeah, I just want to end by pointing out a kind of confusion. So my work, as you kind of situated our works, my work always, emphasizes the animal level. But what I hope you can understand from my work is that I'm not just, you see, the problem is when you work from the kind of stratified reality that you have, you're saying my work is down there in the animal realm. And this is the problem with these stacks, because my work is saying, okay, this reflexive awareness, we're telling, we're naming, we're going to compute. This, just because this is more on the scene recently, it could be a mistake. It could be, there could be an alternative. It could be the wrong way. And I'm saying that these other moves come out of our animal nature, but they're beyond the human condition so far. And this is why it's tricky to have always work from that stack, because I'm not a pagan. So yeah, and you're going like this, I know, and so I just want to end with that. And I too found the conversation lovely and very complex, and probably challenging for many people who they stuck with us, because there's so many different worlds popping up. And so and thank you all so much for being a part of this.
Lovely. I'll just say amen. Bard?
Yeah, I just want to say that this was like the most wonderful check-in with you guys. I'm sitting here on the other side of the Atlantic, and you're some of my best friends in North America, and it's just wonderful to collaborate with you. And I will dig into your work even more than ever, all three of you. And certainly I'm very inspired. I'm working on a term myself at the moment, which was not part of this conversation, but just to point out how inspiring this is. And it's called emotional intelligence. And this is the ridiculous thing. Intelligence is currently the most important word in our language, and it's not been defined by anybody. That in itself is terrible. That's a really dangerous position, that we're actually using the word intelligence as if we knew what we're talking about. There are so many Italian genses to begin with, and AI is just one of them, and a minor one, to be honest about it. So I'm working with the concept of emotional intelligence, which I think ties very nicely with Whitehead and very nicely with Bonita's work. Just an example of how inspiring this conversation is. But that's another conversation altogether, of course.
All right. Well, maybe we'll have future conversations then. All right, folks. Thank you so much, each of you, for bringing your wisdom. It's been a real joy. It's lovely to host this in the context of the UTOK Consilience Conference, and to think about the kinds of philosophies, metaphysic, empirical experiences of being oriented toward wisdom in the 21st century. And I love the dance, and I appreciated the connection. Thanks to everybody. Thanks for all the questions. Super engaging. So what we're doing now is basically you got an hour. I think there's plenty to digest here. Go for a walk, get a cup of coffee. We're back at 1 o'clock where you have 3 options for 3 wonderful symposia. And then again at 3 o'clock, 3 options. I'm really looking forward to the afternoon. I feel like conference off to a great start, and go get some nourishment, share some love, hang out, meditate, etc. We'll see everybody soon. Okay. Take care.